Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
John Keane believes that we are at a turning point. He is professor of politics at the University of Sydney and at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. Keane has done research and published extensively on the topics of democracy and civil society. He argues that, not long ago, it used to be difficult to talk about capitalism. But something seems to have changed, and we might be witnessing something big being born. The beginning of a conversation about income and wealth, social inequality and injustice. In short, a debate about markets and democracy. In his talk, John Keane looks at the history of the relation between civil society and capitalism. Markets, he says, produce communities of friends, but at the same time, they create competition and dysfunction. For example, when large conglomerations of power produce mega projects. If those go wrong, the effects on civil society are catastrophic. Just think of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill or Fukushima. The title of John Keane's talk is Re-Imaging Equality, Reflections on Civil Society and Markets, Past, Present and Future. He gave his talk on May 13, 2014, at the Herrenhausen conference Rethinking Social Inequality. This conference was organized by the Volkswagen Foundation and took place in Hanover, Germany.
Thank you very much, Johanna. If my colleagues at the University of Sydney find out that I am being described as from the University of New South Wales, I'm in very deep trouble. I would like to say herzlichen Dank to Herr Krohl and Katja Ebeling and the other staff for bringing us all together in this, I think, remarkable gathering, which I think has great traction. It has great historical prescience, and I want to try to justify that remark by turning to the subject of Zivilgesellschaft, Zivilsamhälle, Gongmenschhui, Sociedad Civil, Société Civile, Polityczka Obczanska, as they say in South Africa, NGOs, which is an acronym for the next government official, and civil society. This is my topic, and I deliberately mentioned this strange phrase in a number of languages because it has spread globally. It's one of the great questions of our time, it seems to me, whether what was born of Europe actually has a universality. I will hint at that, make a case for it, but let's have a discussion about it. When I think the historians look back on our historical period, and particularly the period since the catastrophes of the 1940s, since 1945, let's say, they will notice one thing, which is every great global issue that has a purchase in daily life and politics globally was born of civil society mechanisms, networks, institutions, individual leaders. Think in sequence of the marriage of human rights, rule of law, and democracy that happened for the first time in the history of democracy at the end of the 1940s. Think of the struggle of the American civil rights movement against a form of apartheid in the United States. Think at the end of the 1950s of the birth of an anti-nuclear movement. Think of the student movement of the 1960s, of which I'm a product. Think of the rebirth of the women's movement. Think of the greening of politics that began to happen probably with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring at the sometime in the 1960s. Think of the politics of disability, of gay, lesbian rights, and now consider the possibility that we are entering a period where these old topics of income and wealth, of social inequality and injustice are returning to the center of global politics. We don't know whether that is the case, but my intuition is that something big is being born. We are at the end of a some 30 to 40 year period where it was difficult to speak about capitalism, where it was difficult to speak about the problem of inequality, but we are witnessing, it seems to me, something of a turning point. Symptomatic is a cacophony of voices and initiatives that are happening at various points on the face of the earth. For example, that Desmond Tutu should speak about the coal industry is symptomatic. That the Indignados in Spain launch a platform for mortgage victims. That there are microcredit schemes, for example, functioning in Bangladesh. That there is the banning of advertising, Sao Paulo. That there are social investment schemes. That there are companies like C&A here in Germany that practice good corporate social responsibility. That there are figures like Bineta Diop of the Femme Africa Solidarité who try to give a voice to voiceless women, and particularly women who are poor. That there are media events like Live Aid and Make Poverty History. All of these, and Occupy has been mentioned, but these are a sort of collage of initiatives, of events that may have a bigger historical significance. And if that's the case, then they have everything to do centrally with the subject of civil society. I want to point out to you, with very little time, that if you look at the language, the theorization of civil society in the last several decades, it has a strange utopian quality for me about it. I was one who participated in the very earliest attempts to try to popularize and reflect upon the concept. But it came to mean, summarized here in the work of Jeffrey Alexander, civil society has come to mean, in all kinds of contexts, a non-violent, freedom-loving, pluralistic, tolerant of differences space that is separated from markets and governing institutions. Here is a classic recent definition by the American sociologist Jeffrey Alexander. Habermas has his own version, that civil society is a sort of third sector that resists the colonization of commodity production and exchange and resists despotic governmental power. What is very odd about this consensus in the reflection in several decades on civil society is the way that markets, that processes of commodity production and exchange mediated by nature are by definition occluded from the category of civil society. And that's very odd, because if you look at the modernization of the category of civil society that happened in the Atlantic region between roughly 1750 and 1848, every single commentator on commodity production and exchange thought of markets as an organizing principle of civil society. So there was no dualism, the dualism that recently has crystallized. Let me give some examples. This discourse on civil society, which begins around 1750, pays attention to the logic of markets within civil society institutions, and it worries about the injustices that markets actually generate within those civil societies. Let me mention Adam Smith's lectures on justice and police. This is from 1763, where he notes that the birth of commerce and exchange, the birth of civil associations that are in some sense in tension with government and governing and legal institutions, are civil societies in which, as he puts it, those people who clothe the whole world are in rags themselves. So aware of the problem of pauperization as an intrinsic feature of modern civil societies in which markets generate, for him and others, they are the prime generator of inequities within these civil societies. Or have a look at, I have written a long historical account into something of a biography of power of Thomas Paine. In his Common Sense, the great pamphlet of the American Revolution, he praised civilized society, and he praised the du commerce of the Americans struggling against the British Empire. But it was later, in his famous Agrarian Justice, which I think is an amazing text. We have Thomas Piketty, who suddenly appeared. I don't know what happened to Tom Paine. There he is. Paine says that the problem with modern civil societies is that they generate great injustices, and he proposed, path-breakingly, the need for a government-provided taxation system that would issue transfer payments to the newly married, to the sick, and the old. And what is remarkable about this text, Agrarian Justice, it's one of the very first to do it, it was first published en français, is that it actually gives poverty for the first time its name. This is a problem, and in the same breath, Paine envisioned its abolition. So the whole idea of poverty as a structured outcome of modern civil societies, that poverty is contingent and that poverty can be remedied, is a product of late 18th century civil societies, and I think it echoes into the 21st century. And you will see here in this famous line from Agrarian Justice that Paine likens in a shocking metaphor that the side-by-side coexistence in modern civil societies of affluence and wretchedness is offensive to the eye. It's like dead and living bodies being chained together. It's a very, very powerful linguistic metaphor. We know that that concern with the Pöbel, Hegel called them, the rabble of paupers, extends through to include Marx, who envisaged, as you know, the abolition of civil society, because for him, civil society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, is synonymous with markets, with commodity production and exchange. That's a category mistake, in my view. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a justification for what in Germany is called Rettende-Kritik. That is, there is a justification for trying to retrieve a language of civil society, to look to the past for some way of getting guidance about developments in the 21st century. And I'm putting to you the proposition that much can be learned from this early modern discourse on civil society because it has a certain pertinence in our times. And the key point is that markets for this period cannot function unless they are embedded in an ensemble, a plurality of civil associations that are protected by law and protected by government. But no markets can function if they destroy the civil associations that are intrinsic to a civil society. Now, it is, as we have heard many times, it is the Piketty moment, because what's remarkable, as I read Capital in the 21st century, is that Piketty, in a way, revives this whole discussion. He wants to say, as has been said, and I summarize it again, that there is a long-term tendency from the 18th century, despite the different forms of capital, from land to industrial to financial capital in the 21st century, there is a long-term trend whereby capital gains at the expense of income and output. This powerful force of divergence, as Piketty says, is destructive of civil society institutions, it's destructive of democracy, and it's destructive of their respective ethics of equality. You know that Piketty, I think, remarkably points out that, as Paul Collier, I thought, very movingly said, and I am of his generation as well, that we grew up in exceptional times. And for Piketty, the expectation that enhanced growth will solve this problem is a will-o'-the-wisp, because there is an growing environmental limit to unlimited growth, because countries at the technological frontier typically cannot grow, according to Piketty, faster than between 1 and 1.5%, and so the distributional problem will not go away. And finally, even modest growth rates, there's no reason for thinking that automatically somehow the inequality gaps of wealth and income will somehow be reduced. So the issue I want to put before you is the relationship between markets and the rest of civil society. Can there be some new accommodation? Can we think of a politics of re-embedding commodity production and exchange processes in civil society institutions so as to tame the inequities that are produced intrinsically, as Piketty and others, and as Smith, Paine, and many of the 18th century and early 19th century showed, which is intrinsic to the functioning of commodity production and exchange processes. Well, one starting point is to recognize, I have no time, I'll do it very quickly, the socializing effects of markets. This is important to keep in mind. Important because, you know, there was in the 20th century the fantasy of abolishing markets. What seems to me to have gone missing, many things more to say, is the way in which markets have socializing effects. This was well understood by political economy at the end of the 18th century. For example, markets cannot function unless they're anchored in the unpaid work of households. Markets have certain civilizing effects. They tend to clump people together. In workplaces, for example, Marx noted this. Markets cannot function if there's systematic violence. Markets engender a certain non-violent tendency. Money and the capacity for monetary calculation has to be a shared quality of actors. Actors have to restrain themselves. Smith called this sympathy. He also pointed out that sympathy is self-love. And there is, in any functioning market, and I'm speaking here ideal-typically, but in any functioning market there has to be a level-headed responsibility for one's actions. One has to know that one can go bust and lose everything. Markets produce a certain capacity to negotiate with strangers. The figure of the stranger is a modern quality, it seems to me. And civil societies, Marcel Mauss reminded us, effect a separation between things and persons so that it's possible to have stretch spatial relations among people. It makes possible the whole transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. This is Francisco Goya's Allegoria del Comercio, which is a sort of metaphor for the way in which markets stretch spatial relations from the very local to the far beyond. And finally, markets embedded in civil society offer the resources. They include freedom of association, which repel and tame the uncivil effects of markets. What I'm talking about here, in the early modern period, market relations embedded in civil society mechanisms gave rise to cooperative associations, friendly societies, scientific and literary circles, publishing houses, newspapers, chapels, guilds, crafts, trade unions, political parties. All of these served to give a certain, to function as a certain lever of empowerment. They were sites where the powerless, through small works in civil society, could achieve bigger things. But we know from the literature, we know from the historical record, Piketty reminds us of this again, that markets have deeply uncivil effects. Market power and market dynamics are aggressive. They have domineering qualities. They can and do cut like a knife into practiced civil society virtues such as civility, mutual recognition, and social solidarity. Despite what Hayek says about the way markets produce a certain catalaxy, as he puts it, that is, it produces a certain community of friends, markets stir up social competition. Someone, as George Orwell repeatedly said, has to lose under conditions of market competition. And as political economists from Smith to Piketty have pointed out, markets therefore vandalize the quest for social equality. We also, I think, can learn much from the classic theories of market failures that stem from the birth of political economy, the invention of political economy at the end of the 18th century. Markets produce dysfunctions. They produce poisonous, toxic effects. And among the candidates in the literature since the end of the 18th century, a part of the discourse on civil society is the theory of alienation, the Verfremdungseffekt. There is the view that markets produce class relations. That was not Marx's invention. It's in fact, the first person to say it is an Englishman named Hall in 1805. That's the objection to markets, that they produce crystallized inequities that ought to be called class relations, and that's something very new and modern. We have the theory that markets produce externalities, that they produce certain public bads like pollution and urban overcrowding. We have the view that markets are prone to crisis and collapse, either because of the anarchy of the market or because of class antagonisms or because of the propensity of firms to cause unemployment by hanging on to their capital, by not placing investment bets, which produces unemployment and so on. And the tendency, Joseph Schumpeter's view, that markets periodically stir up socially destructive storms of technical innovation. I haven't time to talk about the veracity of these insights, but I'm suggesting to you that it would be worth looking at these. It would go beyond Piketty to look at the way in which markets tend to produce dysfunctions, and these dysfunctions have socially destructive, destructive of civil society effects. The inequalities produced by market competition, by the accumulation of capital, is clearly an insight that deserves to be preserved, so that we would see that markets are not describable in the happy terms of Pareto efficiency. They can, and often are, prisons of powerlessness and protectors of dead capital, as De Soto, the Peruvian economist, has pointed out. There is also, I think, scope, and I'm greatly interested in it in my work, in the new 21st century reasons why markets produce dysfunctions and self-paralyzing trends. I have two that I have written about. One is the growth of cancerous forms of arbitrary power within markets, large conglomerate corporate power that manipulates information, and when it goes wrong, it has catastrophic effects on people and the biosphere. This is Deepwater Horizon, and this is the smallest town close to the Fukushima disaster. The point I'm making is that contrary to, let's say, the Hayek view that markets are beautiful because they distribute information and they institutionalize a certain learning capacity, empirically, that is not so, because we are living in the age where large conglomerations of power operating within market settings actually produce bubbles, George Soros's point, but they also produce, Ben Fleabag, the Danish public policy person, has done the best work on this, they produce projects, mega projects, that tend to go way over budget, that tend to be delivered late, and when they go wrong, have catastrophic effects because they have a very large footprint on civil societies and often in cross-border settings. A second example of innovative thinking as to why markets have destructive effects on civil society institutions has to do with the whole conquest of nature dynamic. You know, if you look at Karl Polanyi, you will see that he talks about labor power as a fictitious commodity, but so too is the biosphere. It is a fictitious commodity. It cannot be subsumed under talk of efficiency, of, Walras said, tâtonnement, groping and so on. If you look at the crop of writings that is surfacing now, that began probably with Rachel Carson, look at Elizabeth Kolbert's, for instance, The Sixth Extinction, you will see that the accusation is that there is a great emerging danger in the 21st century, that markets will destroy the biosphere, and the biosphere, if the biosphere is destroyed, then no civil society is possible. In the case of Elizabeth Kolbert, she points out that the rate of extinction at the moment of species in our biomes is about 1,000 times faster than the rate of extinction before humans arose. The whole discussion of the Anthropocene is part of this. In other words, what is now on the agenda for civil societies and for markets is that no civil society can live indefinitely with a glaringly unequal power gap between humans and non-humans. And hence, we are living in times where there are emerging battles over corporations' responsibility for climate change, for biodiversity loss, for chemical proliferation. There is a certain emergence of a politics of consumption, of the environmental shadows and unequal effects of the patterns of consumption that have been institutionalized in all four corners of the earth. I want to ask for the moment, this is my simple version of all of the wonderful charts that were displayed in the last 24 hours. This is the United States. It's a pretty crude Occupy image of the sort of society in the United States that has crystallized, and it's happening elsewhere. Question is, why should we be upset about social inequality? Why, and if it's the case that markets are the chief producer of social inequality, why should we be upset? Why not, with Dostoevsky, read his notes from Underground, say something like, I say let the world go to hell, but I should always just have my tea. Why not adopt that fatalism, après nous le déluge, who cares about this, I'm doing fine. I think we didn't have a discussion, or enough discussion about this so far in our conference. And I can see that here there are again some new reasons why we might object as intellectuals, as policymakers, as foundation directors, as people involved in politics, as people who might be part of the 99%. There are reasons why we need to reflect on this question. Inequality is a choice, says Joseph Stiglitz correctly. It's a choice, and we ought to realize that if it carries on in this way, it will be destructive, actually, of economic growth itself. This is a point, I'm putting it very crudely, that all bearers and owners of capital should be alerted to. If things go on like this, it is not sustainable, even for you. There is also the point, which has been put by many reports, by books like The Spirit Level, that social inequality cannot easily be quarantined. That is to say, everybody suffers within a society, more or less. There is a certain corrosiveness of social inequality, and even the lives of the broad middle class, as is happening in plenty of middle classes in parts of Europe and the United States, and it's beginning to happen in Australia, the middle classes begin to feel the pinch because of the erosion of wealth and incomes and the growth of a whole stratum of the population that is costly for the whole political and social order. And this brings to mind a third justification for why inequality does matter. Rousseau, in the Discourse, it wasn't mentioned yesterday, in that remarkable lecture we heard, spoke about the way in which inequality results for any polity in what he called an égalguéserie, equality in misery. That is to say, nobody can easily protect themselves from those who end up sick, obese, unhappy, unsafe, or in jail. That if you think it's possible to geographically concentrate and to barrier off, you're dreaming, because whole political economies and whole social orders are affected by patterns of poor public health, by heavy policing, by mass incarceration, and so on. Then, finally, we have, as to the argument of why social inequality is normatively questionable, is the whole relationship with democracy. In a way, this connects with this morning's discussion. I'm sorry, because I have no time to talk about this in some depth. But we know, we heard plenty of evidence for this in the last day, that in polities where there is a concentration of wealth and imbalances of income, we know that money speaks, that wealth always counts more than ballots. That is to say, democratic institutions, not only elections, but also monetary bodies, are damaged by patterns of unequal wealth and income. But we also know that normatively there is a major problem. It was, I think, the reason that in sympathy with Paul Collier, I wanted to put my oar in about rescuing the language of democracy, because democracy, this is what, in my history of democracy, this is in the introduction, and it's a long-winded page which basically talks about the novelty of democracy as a political form, stretching from before the classical Greeks through to the 21st century. The point is that democracy, abstractly speaking, is a political form that does not accept that inequalities are natural. All inequalities, whatever their form, are themselves contingent. So that what Tocqueville called the modern democratic revolution was a direct challenge to the view, Sieyès puts this wonderfully in Qu'est-ce que le tiers-état? Sieyès pointed out that at the end of the 18th century, the remarkable thing is that there's a whole stratum of the population, as he puts it, who scarcely even think of themselves as belonging to the same humanity. They have a different body smell, they dress differently, they do not mix with others, they think of themselves as somehow beyond these peuple down there. Democracy, in every context that I've studied, is a challenge to that presumption. And in this sense, the great danger with allowing drift towards highly unequal patterns of wealth and income is that it directly contradicts the norm of equalization of power for which democracy has understood, has stood for and has tried to institutionalize through many different forms, of which elections are only one. It's my favorite formula that democracy is a form of government of the humble, by the humble, for the humble. Nobody is entitled to sit on the throne of power. That is the norm of democracy. And so what we have going on is a sort of cancerous undermining and dissolution of that ethic. If I had time, I would try to complicate the discussion by, it came up in the very first session, of whether in the 21st century, whether we are talking about Gambia or India or Bangladesh or Taiwan or South Africa or Liechtenstein or Canada, whether actually inherited early modern understandings of equality, of the norm of equality, need to be revised. You may know that Pierre Rosanvallon, in a recent book, has, I think it's too French with respect, I think it relies too heavily on Tocqueville, but makes the case that early modern civil societies generated a fantasy of equalization as homogenization. Here he relies on Tocqueville. The semblable was the great utopia of early modern civil societies, says Rosanvallon. And you see this, this is homage to Catalonia in this passage written by George Orwell shortly after arriving in Barcelona in December 1936, where the very striking thing for him, and aesthetically he's greatly attracted by it, is the fact that class is abolished, that people think of themselves in urban Barcelona with red flags flying and hammers and sickles everywhere. They think of themselves as the same. And Rosanvallon has pointed out that, in fact, we will have to rethink that, so that simple notions of equality as homogenization will need to be replaced by complex understandings of democracy. I'm very sympathetic to that, the need for a new and more complex grammar of equality that will, to be sure, include matters of wealth and power at their heart, but will also have to take into account divergence, pluralism, complexity of identities as part of the difficult politics of equalization of power. Here I would just mention that this is a live issue. For instance, in the United States, let me give the case of the conflicting understandings of the norm of equality and the need to shift to a more complex form of equality. Is that? Oh, 0 minutes. Okay, all right, then I'm going to do something pretty radical. I'm going to finish, if I may, in 1 minute. What does it mean to speak about a politics of a more complex grammar of equality. This is going to sound ridiculously simple, but what I propose in the paper, you're very welcome to have sight of it, is the need, following Polanyi, to re-embed markets in civil society institutions and even in cross-border settings, if that can be done. The rule is no civil society, no markets. That's the lesson from the Soviet and Chinese models of socialism, but the inverse is also true. No markets, no civil society. That's the lesson of cases as different as Solidarność or Pol Pot's Cambodia. I want very quickly, you can read this for yourself, make a case for rethinking Karl Polanyi's great The Origins of Our Times was the first title, published in 1944. It became The Great Transformation. It's an argument for re-embedding markets within basically civil society institutions protected by state institutions. But I go on to the end of this paper, and I really will finish by getting to the point. You know that it was, I think, President Truman who said, please give me a one-armed economist. They constantly come in here saying, on the one hand, on the other hand. I think when all is boiled down, what does this all mean? What is the attempt to revive and keep alive the language of civil society? The call for the re-embedding of markets. What does it actually mean in the early years of the 21st century? I think, to put it bluntly, that the old utopias of socialism, of anarcho-syndicalism, are finished. I don't think it's possible, and there are good reasons why they're finished, for the abuse of power, the hubris, the violence that resulted from those experiments. But what does it actually mean to talk about the norms of civil society and markets in the 21st century as they relate to the problem of social inequality? What, in other words, is the equivalent of those struggles from the end of the 18th century through the 19th and early 20th century, the struggle to restrict commodity production and exchange, to rein it back in, to make companies socially responsible? What is the equivalent of this 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest? What does a new settlement mean today? I recommend to you Jeff Mulgan's The Locust and the Bee. Does it mean government-initiated social innovation and investment funds? Should we try to be moving towards a carbon-neutral, circular, open data economy? Crowdsourced capital funding? What about the struggle for a relational economy? Think of initiatives like Facebook or peer-to-peer collaboration such as Airbnb, the largest hotel chain in the world, or social innovation cities like Seoul. What about the caring industries, for example, in the field of aging? What about anti-corruption initiatives that come from civil society, ipaidbribe.com, or the banning of billboard advertising in cities like Sao Paulo? What about the future of trade unions? What about bans on advertising? What about public-private partnerships? Well, these are questions I hope we'll discuss. I want to just end, if I may, with this intriguing remark by William Morris, the English socialist at the end of the 19th century, who pointed out that modern struggles for equalization of power paraded under various names. They were called socialism in his time, but there were earlier periods where that word wasn't used. And Morris here points out that there is a peculiar ironic pattern in European and probably, he would have thought, global history, in which people lose battles for ideals, but those ideals resurface in other forms, and they resurface under other names, where people take up a fight to renew that struggle. It seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that something like that is going on in our times. It's forbidden to talk about socialism. We cannot reimagine reviving the anarcho-syndicalist tradition. The Soviet model, and I would say even the Chinese model, is not the future, but it's as if we lack a language for the politics to come, because what's clear, and Piketty is not the only one to say it, is that these tendencies are not sustainable. Thank you very much.